Okay, so let's take a look at what Visual Studio does when we try and run using Docker an ASP.NET Core Web API. We're going to look at that locally, and that's fairly trivial. So we're going to quickly move from that into looking at running our API using, again, Docker, but from PowerShell. So first thing we need is an ASP.NET Core Web API project. So let's go ahead and create that. Just your typical weather forecast one is all we need, because we don't care about the contents of what the API does for this show. Let's call it local API, and don't configure it for HTTPS. There's another show which talks about that. I'm going to keep the Swagger on and just use the minimal APIs for simplicity. Okay, you can see it's created our Docker file, and in looking in Docker Desktop, we can see it's already created the local API image for us, and it should be spinning up, there we go, the local API container. Now that container can't be hit yet. You have to have it running in Visual Studio in order for that to work. So let's go ahead and fire that up. Hit F5, and there we have it. A very simple running boilerplate API. And as soon as we close that, you'll notice that it is no longer accessible like we discussed before. Now there's one interesting aspect here that I wanted to show you. The port here is 32776. Now I haven't defined 32776 anywhere in my code, so it's 32776, just doing a search and there's nothing. Where that is set up is in the launch settings. We've got Docker in the profiles, which you'll see map to what's up here. We're interested in the Docker one, and this publish all ports true is effectively what's mapping our port 8080, which is exposed, to kind of a random port. Okay, so what if we want it to be fixed? We can simply go HTTP port, tell it which port we would like. So let's say 32721, and we'll get rid of that, save and run it again. And this time it should fire up on port 30721 as we've told it. And it's preferable to know what the exactly what the port will be, because you might be using a tool like Postman or Hoppscotch, for example. If you can put in your URL in here, let's see if I've got that. Okay, and send. So we get the response. So if you've got tests set up in Postman or just a collection to test when you're working locally, and this port number changes all the time, it's just not ideal. But by default, just simply mapping all the ports to a random port, yeah, that's a helpful way to get started. Okay, so let's stop Visual Studio, and you'll notice that our container is still running, not accessible. Then, okay, so let's close Visual Studio. Before I do that, I'm just going to change this to the container tools and grab this text, because we're going to be interested in that. All right, so we're going to close that off, and you can see now our container has dropped off, and the image is still there, which is fine, no problem with that. Okay, so now let's get this working. with PowerShell. So first, let's just drop those notes, that text that I copied from the container tools from Visual Studio. The thing that we're interested in, well, the things that we're interested in here is the Docker build and the Docker run, but we'll come back to that. First, let's try and run, do a Docker build and a Docker run ourselves. So normally you'd want to do that. Now I'm just using PowerShell in the terminal here, part of Visual Studio Code, because it's a great place I can show you the code that the script that I'm writing up here. So we're going to do Docker build. I'm going to give it a tag of local API. Let's just do -1 to make it stand out a little bit more, and we'll make our context the current folder. So we need to change to the folder that we have our Docker file in, which is the same as the project file. So we can see our Docker file here. So now this is good to go. Let's see what happens when we execute this in that folder. Okay, invalid tag. Repository must be the local case. Okay, rookie error there. Just keep that all as lowercase for the tag. F8. Okay, yep, no, got a problem. Failed to resolve, check some, project not found. Why is the project not found? Well, the project's not found because if we look at our Docker file, which is here, and we've got the copy of the csproj, and it's expecting it to be in a subfolder, local API. So you can see down the bottom here, when we executed, line 11 is where we've had an issue, and it can't find that project. And that's because we're in this folder, we're already in the directory where the csproj is. If we just do a quick list, we're here, it's not in a subdirectory. So what we need to do is go up one into the parent, and then we can try to run this again. And it's going to fail because it can't find, now it can't find the Docker file. So let's tell it where it is with that. It's in local API and it's called dockerfile. Okay, so run that. And now we should have a local API-1 image, which we can now try and run. Okay, so Docker run. What image are we trying to run? We're going to call the local API-1. I want to give it a name of the same, local API-1. And let's see what problems we hit or if that works. Okay, now I haven't added a -dt, so it's kind of stuck here. We could probably test to see if it still works, because that spun up a container here, and we also haven't mapped any ports, so this isn't helpful. So we're going to cancel that. Just Control-C will shut that down. Then we're going to do the magic map all ports. So it'll give us a random port. And what was the other thing? Oh, we need to run it in detached mode. So run dt. Let's see if this is a bit more helpful. Okay. Oh, it's already in use because I'm using the same name. So let's just very quickly delete this guy and go again. Cool, so we've got a container. It's running. If we hit that port of 32779, need to tell it let's have a look at the Swagger, see if that's there. Not there, and I'll show you why in a minute. Okay, so is the weather forecast available? Yes, it is. Okay, so it's working. Why wasn't the Swagger working? Because it was working when we tried it from Visual Studio. Okay, so this is where we'll take a look at what Visual Studio does. So I've got the Visual Studio Docker build and Docker run in the notes file here. I'm going to just pull them out and chuck them at the top. So there's one, and Docker run is here. Okay, so there's our two commands. They're a little bit difficult to read, so let's quickly jump into ChatGPT and ask it to format it for us. So PowerShell multi-line. See if that's good enough of a command. Yep, figured it out. Brilliant. So now I can copy the code, and rather than this big long line, which is a little difficult to read, we now get a nicely formatted one. And we'll do the same with the Docker run whilst we're here. Can I do this? This 1, 2. Yep. All right. So I'll just wait for it to complete and then copy code. Nice, easy, quick way to format your very long commands. Okay. So Docker build. One thing that we can see here that it's doing differently that's of note is it's passing in the build configuration of debug. So if we've got the Docker file here, the build configuration default is release. But when it's running from Visual Studio, it's doing it in debug mode. Okay, great. But why wasn't the Swagger working from our script, from our Docker run, but it does work from Visual Studio? So let's just clean up these commands a little bit and just remove all those volumes. We don't need those. Disable colors, doesn't have anything to do with it. The ASP.NET Core environment equals development. That is the reason why we're not seeing any Swagger. Because if we have a look at the code, there is this: if the app environment is development, then set up your Swagger. Now there's two ways we can fix this. We can do what Visual Studio does and add the environment variable of development, or a lot of the time you're going to want your Swagger available on an API in production as well as in development. And that's a decision you need to make, but usually I will remove this, and then your Swagger will be available all of the time. Okay, so we've seen how to run it with Visual Studio and debug, and we've seen how to run it with PowerShell and just simply get our container up and running, so it's available with or without Visual Studio. Yeah, so the next thing you're going to want to do is run this in the cloud. So check the show notes for some links to shows where I'll push this to an Azure App Service and an Azure Container App. And we'll encounter a few challenges and solve those, and also make sure that we're not getting a big bill. So check those out. Thanks for watching. Be kind, be curious, go out and create something great.